2:15 in the morning. The aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman moved through the dark waters of the Ionian Sea at 22 knots. This was not a standard transit. The carrier strike group was operating under total electronic silence to test a new networked acoustic sensor array known as Project Silent Shield. No one on board realized that the perfect silence they were maintaining was about to be shattered by a physical ghost. The Mediterranean night was heavy and absolute. A thick layer of clouds blocked the moon and stars. This left the bridge crew dependent on the dim green glow of their instruments. Below the flight deck, the Combat Information Center was a hive of quiet activity. Technicians monitored the new sensor array. They were confident. The system was designed to detect any underwater or surface contact within 50 nautical miles. On the screens, the ocean was a vast and empty void. On the starboard bridge wing, Seaman Recruit Miller adjusted his night vision goggles. He was 19 years old. This was his first deployment. His job was simple but tedious. He was the human backup to the most expensive sensor suite in the world. The air was cool and smelled of salt and jet fuel. Miller panned his gaze across the horizon. The carrier was a city of steel. It displaced 100,000 tons. It felt invincible. The silence of the emission control mission made the ship feel like a predator in the dark. But Miller saw something that did not belong. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. It looked like a break in the waves. A low and jagged shape was cutting through the water. It was less than 200 meters away. Miller blinked. He adjusted the focus on his goggles. The shape remained. It was long. It was black. It was moving at the same speed as the carrier. It had no lights. It had no radar signature. It was a hull. Miller spoke into his headset. Bridge. This is Lookout Starboard 1. I have a visual on a surface contact, bearing 090. Distance is 200 meters. The response from the bridge was immediate and skeptical. The officer of the deck responded, Starboard 1, confirm your report. Our screens are clear. There is nothing within 20 miles of our position. Miller gripped the railing. His knuckles were white. Sir, I confirm. I have a visual. It is a submarine. It is right next to us. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tone changed. The tactical action officer leaned over a console. Check the thermal. Check the passive sonar. I want a full sweep of the inner screen. The technician responded, Sir, sensors are nominal. The water is clear. There is no biological or mechanical noise. The screen is clean. On the bridge, the officer of the deck stepped onto the wing. He took a pair of binoculars from his neck. He looked where Miller was pointing. For 5 seconds, he saw nothing but the dark sea. Then the carrier took a slight roll to the port side. The angle of the bridge changed. The officer froze. In the faint wash of the carrier wake, a massive black sail was visible. It was the tower of a submarine. It was so close he could see the rivets on the casing. It was a Russian Yasen-class nuclear boat. It had followed them through the heart of their defenses without making a single sound. The officer hit the intercom. General quarters. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:17 in the morning. The general quarters alarm ripped through the sleeping decks of the carrier. 5,000 sailors scrambled from their bunks. The transition from silence to chaos was instantaneous. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and nervous sweat. Every console was bathed in red light. The tactical action officer, known as the TAO, stared at his display. It was still empty. The tactical action officer spoke into his headset. Bridge, CIC. We have no contact. I say again, we are clear on all sensors. Radar is passive. Sonar is passive. We are blind to whatever the lookout is seeing. The captain of the Truman reached the bridge. He did not ask for a report. He looked out the starboard windows. He did not need binoculars. The black shape was less than 150 meters away now. It was a mountain of steel, rising from the black water. It moved with a terrifying grace. It was the Kazan, a Yasen-M class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine. It was the most advanced boat in the Russian Northern Fleet. The captain spoke to the officer of the deck. Initiate active sonar. Break electronic silence. I want a firm track now. The order was relayed. A moment later, a massive pulse of sound left the hull of the carrier. It was a physical blow. The ping of active sonar was so powerful it vibrated through the steel deck. On the screens in the Combat Information Center, the ocean finally spoke. A massive return appeared right on their doorstep. It was so close, the computer initially flagged it as a system error. 2:19 in the morning. 300 feet below the surface of the Black Tower, inside the Russian submarine, the world was a nightmare of failing systems. The commander of the Kazan stood at the center of his command post. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking for a way to save his crew, the Russian sonar officer shouted, over the scream of high-pressure steam. Captain, we are being illuminated. The American carrier is active. The commander looked at a flickering gauge. His voice was steady. They know we are here. They do not know why. Keep the depth steady. Do not deviate from the carrier's course. The executive officer stepped forward. Sir, if we stay this close, their escort will have a firing solution in seconds. We are defenseless in this state. The commander gripped the edge of the chart table. If we dive, we die. The cooling loop is fractured. We stay on the surface. We stay in their shadow. 2:21 in the morning. Back on the bridge of the Truman, the situation was escalating. Two American destroyers, the USS Arleigh Burke and the USS Cole, were banking hard toward the carrier. Their searchlights cut through the darkness. The beams hit the Russian submarine. The light reflected off the black rubber tiles of the hull. It looked like a sea monster, caught in a spotlight. The tactical action officer reported from the Combat Information Center. Sir, the contact is matching our speed. Exactly 22 knots. They are maintaining station. They are not maneuvering. The captain of the Truman narrowed his eyes. They are mocking us. They walked through a billion-dollar sensor net, and now they are pacing us. The radio on the bridge crackled. It was the commander of the destroyer screen. Truman, this is Arleigh Burke. We have a clear firing solution with anti-submarine rockets. Request permission to prosecute the contact. The captain looked at the black hull. Something was wrong. There were no sailors on the deck of the submarine. There were no lights in the bridge windows. It was a ghost ship. The captain spoke into the radio. Negative. Stand down. Do not engage. We need to know why they are not submerged. As he spoke, a dull thud echoed through the water. It was the sound of heavy metal shifting. On the deck of the Russian submarine, a large rectangular hatch began to cycle open. The bridge crew of the Truman held their breath. Those hatches were designed for vertical launch cruise missiles. 2:23 in the morning. The hatch on the Russian submarine was fully open. It was a dark, square void on the deck of the casing. On the Truman, every weapons officer saw the same thing. To them, it looked like a missile silo preparing for launch. The proximity was the problem. At less than 200 meters, the carrier was a massive, unmissable target. The tactical action officer shouted into his headset, "Captain, vertical launch hatch is open. We are inside the minimum engagement range for their cruise missiles. If they fire, our defensive systems will not have time to react. We cannot stop them." The captain of the Truman felt the weight of the moment. He turned to the communications officer. "Get the admiral on the line. Now." Rear Admiral Harrison spoke from the flag bridge. His voice was cold and measured. "Truman, this is flag. Do not fire. If they wanted to kill us, they would have stayed submerged. They are making a statement, or they are in trouble." "Admiral, they have a tube open," the captain replied. "The Arleigh Burke is requesting permission to fire a warning shot. They are ready to engage with the 5-inch gun." "Negative. Denied," the admiral said. "We do not fire first. Not tonight. Not in these waters." 2:26 in the morning. Inside the Russian submarine Kazan, the air was becoming unbreathable. The temperature in the engine room was climbing toward 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam hissed from a ruptured joint in the primary cooling loop. It was a high-pressure mist that filled the compartments with a blinding white fog. The Russian commander wiped sweat from his eyes. His breathing was heavy. "Status of the hatch," the engineer responded. "The heat is too high. The pressure in the hull is expanding. I had to vent the atmosphere to prevent a casing failure. The hatch is for ventilation. It is not a weapon." "The Americans will not know that," the commander said. "They will see a missile tube. They will see an act of war. They are illuminating us with everything they have. We have no radio, Captain," the executive officer said. "The main antenna is shorted by the steam. The hull is vibrating from their active sonar. It is like being inside a bell. Try the handheld radio," the commander ordered. "The emergency frequency. Someone must be listening. Tell them we are not a threat." 2:28 in the morning. The USS Arleigh Burke was now only 500 meters from the Russian boat. It was a dangerous game of chicken at 22 knots. The destroyer was small compared to the carrier, but it was bristling with weapons. Its 5-inch gun was trained on the Russian sail. On the bridge, the crew could see the individual tiles of the submarine's skin. The commander of the Arleigh Burke spoke to his crew. "Maintain distance. If that submarine makes any sudden turn, we are going to collide. Watch that hatch. If anything moves inside it, we engage with everything. Do not let them get a shot off." A sailor on the bridge of the destroyer looked through a high-powered thermal camera. "Sir, look at the heat signature. The hatch is glowing. It is not a missile launch. It is steam. They are venting internal atmosphere." The report was relayed back to the Truman. The captain looked at the thermal feed on the main screen. A plume of white heat was rising from the open hatch. It was not the sharp, hot spike of a rocket motor. It was a soft, dissipating cloud. 2:30 in the morning. The Russian submarine began to slow down. Its speed dropped from 22 knots to 18, then 15. The massive carrier began to pull ahead, its wake tossing the smaller submarine like a toy. The Kazan was losing power. The admiral watched from the flag bridge. "They are dead in the water. Look at the wake. The propellers are stopping. They are losing their propulsion." The ocean around the Kazan began to churn. Bubbles broke the surface. The submarine was struggling to stay buoyant. It was sinking. Not a controlled dive, but a slow, heavy descent. The stern was dipping into the black water. The captain of the Truman picked up the radio. "All ships. This is Truman. The contact is foundering. Prepare for search and rescue operations. But keep your weapons hot. This could still be a trap." The Russian boat vanished beneath the black waves. For 30 seconds, there was only the sound of the carrier's engines and the rush of the wind. Then, a massive explosion rocked the sea. 2:32 in the morning. The explosion was not a weapon. It was a massive concussive thud that traveled through the water and rattled the hull of the USS Harry Truman. In the Combat Information Center, the sonar screens bloomed with white noise. The sound was the death rattle of a high-pressure steam line. The captain gripped the edge of the console. "Sonar. Did they fire? Is there a torpedo in the water?" The sonar supervisor pressed his headsets to his ears. "Negative, Captain. No transient launch detected. No screw noise from a weapon. That was a structural failure or an internal blast. The Kazan is still there. She is heavy and sinking fast." On the bridge, the officer of the deck watched the spot where the submarine had disappeared. The water was boiling with white foam and air. A massive bubble of compressed gas broke the surface. It smelled of scorched oil and chemicals. 2:34 in the morning. Inside the Kazan, the situation was catastrophic. The explosion had occurred in the secondary cooling loop. The compartment was now a tomb of high-pressure steam and darkness. The emergency lighting flickered, casting a sickly red glow over the command center. The Russian commander shouted over the roar of escaping air. "Blow all main ballast tanks. Emergency surfacing. Now. Now. Now." The chief engineer struggled with the manual valves. The automatic systems were dead. "Captain, The stern planes are jammed. We are going down by the tail. Use the high-pressure air, the commander ordered. If we do not surface in 30 seconds, the pressure will crush the inner hull. Give me everything we have, the submarine groaned. It was a sound like a giant twisting a sheet of metal. The Kazan was 300 meters down and still falling. Then, the high-pressure air finally found its way into the tanks. The descent slowed. Then, it stopped. 2:36 in the morning. The USS Arleigh Burke moved into a flanking position. The captain of the destroyer was watching the sonar feed. They are coming up. Fast. They are going to breach. The destroyer veered to port, its engine screaming. Behind it, the ocean surface began to dome upward. It looked like a mountain was rising from the depths. 2:38 in the morning. The Kazan erupted from the sea. The massive black bow cleared the water by 30 feet before crashing back down. The impact sent a wall of spray 100 meters into the air. The submarine was now listing heavily to the starboard side. It was dead in the water. Smoke, thick and yellow, began to pour from the open ventilation hatch. On the bridge of the Truman, the admiral watched through binoculars. The Russian boat was a broken animal. It was no longer a predator. It was a hazard. The admiral spoke into the fleet net. All ships. This is flag. Maintain a 500-meter standoff. Do not approach. They are venting toxic gases. We are moving to a rescue posture, but stay at high alert. I want the SEAL team on the flight deck, ready for boarding if they ask, or if they do not. The Russian boat sat low in the water. It was a silent, smoking island of steel. The question now was not who would fire first, but who would die first. 2:40 in the morning. The yellow smoke billowing from the Kazan reached a height of 50 meters before the wind caught it. It was a toxic cocktail of battery acid and scorched wiring. On the flight deck of the USS Harry Truman, a Seahawk helicopter sat, with its rotors blurring into a silver disc. The searchlights from the carrier illuminated the submarine, making it look like a dying whale in a surgical theater. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere shifted from tactical curiosity to cold dread. The radiation technicians were monitoring the air quality around the Russian boat. The specialist spoke into his headset. "Captain, no ionizing radiation detected. The reactor is likely scrammed, but that smoke is lethal. If they do not evacuate the lower decks in 10 minutes, there will be no survivors." The captain looked dark at the admiral. "We have to send a boarding party, medical and engineering. If we wait for a Russian rescue ship, we are just watching a mass casualty event." Admiral Harrison shook his head. "If we put boots on that deck, it is an act of boarding a sovereign vessel. The Russians will call it an act of war. We wait for a signal." 2:43 in the morning. Inside the Kazan, the Russian commander was losing his grip on the situation. The air was a thick, hot soup. Half his crew was unconscious. The emergency batteries were draining. Every light on the command console was red. The executive officer slumped against a bulkhead. His voice was a rasping whisper. "Captain, the American helicopter is hovering 50 meters above the sail. They are lowering a basket. They want to help." The commander looked at the handheld radio on the chart table. To pick it up was to admit total failure. To stay silent was to sign a death warrant for 80 men. "We do not accept. We are a nuclear-powered vessel of the Northern Fleet. We wait for the Kulikov. The Kulikov is 40 miles away." "Captain," the officer replied, "they will not arrive for an hour. We have 5 minutes of oxygen left." The commander did not answer. He looked at the bulkhead. He could hear the thrum of the American helicopter through the thick steel of the hull. It was the sound of a lifeline he was too proud to grab. 2:46 in the morning. The situation outside changed in a heartbeat. A new contact appeared on the Truman's long-range radar. It was moving at 35 knots, coming from the northeast. It was a Russian Udaloy-class destroyer. The Vice Admiral Kulikov. It was charging toward the carrier strike group with its fire control radars at maximum power. The tactical action officer shouted, "Captain, new contact! Russian surface combatant. They are painting us with top steer radar. They are in a full attack profile." The radio on the bridge screamed to life. A voice spoke in heavily accented English. "American carrier. This is Russian Navy ship 626. You will move 5 nautical miles away from our submarine immediately. Any attempt to board will be met with lethal force. We are authorized to defend our vessel." The captain of the Truman grabbed the handset. "Russian vessel. This is Truman. Your submarine is in distress. We are attempting to provide medical aid and atmospheric support. We have no hostile intent. Move away," the Russian voice repeated. "Or we fire." On the deck of the Kazan, the ventilation hatch suddenly stopped smoking. A thick, oily liquid began to spill out of the opening and into the sea. It was primary coolant. The reactor was melting down. The admiral stared at the sensor feed. The buildup was over. Both sides were now committed to a collision course that had no easy exit. The Russian destroyer was closing the distance. The American destroyers were moving to intercept. The sky was about to become very crowded. 2:48 in the morning. The Russian destroyer Vice Admiral Kulikov was now 18 nautical miles from the carrier. It was moving at 36 knots. Every radar on the ship was active. On the bridge of the USS Harry Truman, the air was static with the hum of the Aegis combat system. The tactical display showed a bright red line connecting the Russian ship to the carrier. It was a fire control lock. The tactical action officer shouted, "Captain, we are painted. The Kulikov has a solid track on our bridge. Their surface-to-surface missiles are warm." The captain of the Truman spoke into the fleet net. "Arleigh Burke, Cole, you are weapons free to defend the high-value unit. Do not fire unless they launch, but do not let a single bird hit this deck." 2:48 and 30 seconds in the morning. 5 miles away, the USS Arleigh Burke tilted its hull as it made a high-speed turn. The armored covers of its vertical launch system slid open. Inside the cells, 64 missiles waited for a digital command. The destroyer was now positioned directly between the Russian ship and the carrier. It was a wall of steel and explosives. The commander of the Arleigh Burke watched his screen. "Target the Kulikov. Lock the 5-inch gun. If they blink, we take them to the bottom." 2:49 in the morning. On the flight deck of the Truman, the Seahawk helicopter pilot looked down at the Kazan. The submarine was now surrounded by a shimmering, oily slick. The water was boiling. The radiation alarms in the cockpit began to chirp. It was a low, rhythmic pulse. The pilot spoke into his radio. "Control, we have a radiation spike. It is climbing. The hull of the submarine is glowing in the dark." The admiral heard the report on the bridge. He looked at the Kulikov on the radar. The Russian ship was ignoring the danger to its own men. It was focused only on the American carrier. "They are going to fire," the admiral whispered. "They think we are attacking the Kazan. They are going to start a war to protect a dead boat." 2:49 and 30 seconds in the morning. Inside the Combat Information Center, the automated defense systems transitioned to auto special. This meant the computer would fire the close-in weapon systems without human intervention if it detected an incoming missile. The Gatling guns on the side of the carrier began to track toward the horizon. They spun at 4,000 rounds per minute. The sound was a low, mechanical growl that vibrated through the floor. The captain put his hand on the master arm switch. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "Wait for the launch," he said. "Wait for the launch." On the Russian destroyer, the weapons officer turned the physical key. The missile canisters on the deck hissed as the cooling gas was released. The safety was off. The distance was now 12 miles, a 10-second flight time. 2:50 in the morning. The finger of the Russian weapons officer was on the trigger. The American Aegis system was seconds from autonomous fire. The air was thick with the invisible energy of a dozen high-powered radars. On the bridge of the USS Harry Truman, the silence was absolute. The captain stood with his hand on the console, waiting for the first flash of a missile launch on the horizon. The radio on the bridge-to-bridge channel 16 hissed with static. Then, a voice broke through. It was not the crisp, aggressive tone of the Russian destroyer. It was a human voice, ragged and punctuated by heavy coughing. The voice spoke in English. "American carrier. This is the commanding officer of the Kazan. I am speaking from the bridge of my vessel. Do not fire. I say again, do not fire on the Kulikov." The captain of the Truman grabbed his binoculars. On the thermal monitor, a lone figure was visible on the sail of the Russian submarine. The man was standing in the middle of the yellow smoke. He was not wearing a gas mask. He was holding a small, orange handheld maritime radio. It was the kind used by civilian yachts. The Russian commander spoke again. His voice was thick and wet. "My reactor is under control." The explosion was a secondary steam line. "There is no radiation leak. I repeat, there is no radiation. The Kulikov is acting on a false sensor report. They believe you are initiating a boarding action under the cover of a disaster." Admiral Harrison grabbed the radio handset. "Kazan. This is Truman. We see you. We are standing down our interceptors. We are not boarding. We were prepared to offer medical assistance only. Tell your destroyer to break their fire control lock immediately." The figure on the sail of the submarine turned toward the northeast. He raised a flare gun and fired a single green star into the dark sky. It was the international signal for all clear. On the radar screens inside the Combat Information Center, the red lines began to flicker. The jagged spike of the Russian fire control radar vanished. The Vice Admiral Kulikov began a hard, leaning turn to its starboard side. Its speed dropped from 36 knots to 12. The aggressive attack profile was gone. The tactical action officer let out a long breath. "Captain, the Kulikov has broken lock. They are transitioning to a search and rescue posture. Their weapons are cold. 2:55 in the morning. The pivot was complete." The momentum of a global conflict had been halted by a single man standing in a cloud of toxic smoke, choosing the lives of his crew over the pride of his flag. The Russian commander remained on the sail. He was visible in the American searchlights, a small silhouette against the massive black hull of his broken ship. The admiral sat down in his command chair. He looked at the captain. He knew his own side was going to start a war to save face. He went topside without a mask just to get a signal out to us. If he had waited for his own fleet to talk to ours, we would be trading missiles by now. The captain nodded. Professional to professional. He bypassed the chain of command to save the world. The smoke from the Kazan was starting to thin, but the submarine was sitting even lower in the water. The Russian destroyer was now only 3 miles away. It was slowing down, its own searchlights finally finding the submarine. The Russian commander spoke into the handheld radio one last time. "Truman, thank you for the light. We can see our way home now. Please, leave us the dark." The admiral picked up the radio. "Copy that, Kazan. We are moving to 5 miles. We will keep a watch on you until the Kulikov is alongside." "Good luck, Captain." The massive aircraft carrier began a slow, heavy turn away from the scene. The American destroyers followed. The crisis had broken, but the silence that followed felt heavy. Both sides had looked into the abyss, and both had seen how easy it was to fall in. 2:52 in the morning. The USS Harry Truman turned its massive bow to the west. It moved away from the smoking Russian submarine at a steady 15 knots. Behind it, the 2 American destroyers, the Arleigh Burke and the Cole, moved into a defensive screen. They were no longer hunting. They were watching. The lethal tension of the last 30 minutes began to drain from the bridge, replaced by a cold, hollow exhaustion. Inside the Combat Information Center, the technicians sat back in their chairs. Some wiped sweat from their foreheads, others just stared at their screens. The red auto-engage lights were now dark. The primary sensor display showed the Russian destroyer, the Kulikov, closing the final mile to the Kazan. The tactical action officer looked at the admiral. "Sir, the Kulikov is coming alongside the submarine. They are preparing to pass a tow line." The radiation levels remain baseline. The Russian commander was telling the truth. Admiral Harrison did not look relieved. He looked troubled. He saved his crew, but he also saved us from a mistake that would have lasted a century. I want a full diagnostic on Project Silent Shield. I want to know how a $100 million acoustic array missed a 80,000-ton submarine until a 19-year-old kid saw it with his own eyes. 2:56 in the morning. On the deck of the Vice Admiral Kulikov, the Russian sailors worked with frantic precision. They were not wearing the dress uniforms of a proud navy. They were in fire-retardant coveralls and gas masks. They threw heavy lines toward the listing deck of the Kazan. The Russian destroyer captain stood on his bridge. He watched the American carrier move into the distance. His fire control radar was now in standby mode. He felt a deep sense of shame mixed with relief. He had almost fired on a carrier strike, group based on a sensor ghost and a lack of communication. The destroyer captain spoke into his internal comms. "Get a medical team onto the Kazan. I want their commander brought to our sickbay immediately. He has been breathing battery acid for 20 minutes. And tell the fleet, command that the Americans have disengaged. The situation is stable." 3 o'clock in the morning. The Ionian Sea was no longer a battlefield. It was a recovery zone. The searchlights from the Kulikov crisscrossed the water, illuminating the transfer of wounded sailors from the submarine to the destroyer. The Kazan looked like a black tooth jutting out of the water, its power gone, its mission a failure. On the bridge of the Truman, the captain watched the Russian operation through a long-range thermal camera. He saw the figure of the Russian commander being helped toward the destroyer. The man was swaying. He looked frail. The captain turned to the admiral. "He is off the boat, sir. They are taking him aboard the Kulikov." "Good," the admiral said. "He is the only reason. We are still breathing this air. But this is not over. The Pentagon is going to want to know how the Kazan got into the inner screen. If they can do it to the Truman, they can do it to any carrier in the fleet." 3:05 in the morning. The Truman increased its speed to 25 knots. The distance between the two navies grew. The electronic silence was gone. The air was now full of encrypted burst transmissions as both sides reported the incident to their respective capitals. In Washington and Moscow, the sun was not yet up, but the lights were coming on in the situation rooms. The immediate threat of fire had passed. Now, the strategic fallout was beginning. The steel shadow had been chased away, but it had left a permanent mark on the American perception of their own invincibility. 3:15 in the morning. 10 nautical miles now separated the aircraft carrier from the crippled submarine. The USS Harry Truman had resumed a standard defensive posture. The experiment with electronic silence was over. The project, known as Silent Shield, was officially suspended by order of the Admiral. The fleet was now broadcasting at full power. Every radar was spinning. Every sonar was active. The ocean was no longer a place of secrets. Admiral Harrison stood on the flag bridge. He looked at the glowing tactical display. "The silence was our biggest weakness," he said to his chief of staff. "We were so focused on not being heard that we forgot how to listen with our own sensors. We created a blind spot, and the Russians walked right into it." "Sir," the chief of staff replied, "the technical team is already pulling the logs. They want to know why the acoustic array filtered out the Kazan as background noise. It filtered it out because the Kazan was not moving like a submarine," the admiral said. "It was drifting. It was a metal log in the water. The software saw massive contact but decided it was a thermal layer or a whale. It took a human eye to see the truth." 3:30 in the morning. A new radar contact appeared on the long-range sweep. It was coming from the north, moving at 20 knots. It was the Nikolai Chaiker. It was a massive Russian ocean-going tug. It had been shadowed by NATO aircraft since it left the port of Sevastopol 3 days earlier. The captain of the Truman studied the speed and heading of the tug. They sent the Chaiker hours before we even knew the Kazan was there. The Russians knew that boat was failing long before it surfaced next to us. They were trying to reach a rendezvous point, and we were sitting right in the middle of their escape route, the officer of the deck added. The Kazan did not hunt us. They stumbled into us while they were dying. The realization settled over the bridge. This was not a calculated provocation. It was a statistical nightmare. Two of the most powerful machines on the planet had occupied the same square kilometer of ocean by pure, terrifying chance. 3:45 in the morning. The Russian group was now a cluster of lights on the horizon. The Vice Admiral Kulikov had successfully passed a tow line to the Kazan. The submarine was no longer sinking. It sat low and heavy in the water, but it was stable. The yellow smoke had stopped. The Nikolai Chaiker arrived and began to take over the primary tow. Inside the medical bay of the Russian destroyer, the commander of the Kazan lay on a narrow cot. An oxygen mask was strapped to his face. His lungs burned with every breath. He could hear the heavy thud of the tow line pulling against the hull of the destroyer. He was alive. His crew was alive. But he knew his career was over. He had allowed his ship to be detected. He had spoken to the Americans on an open channel. The destroyer captain stood over him. He did not look angry. He looked tired. "The Americans are moving away," the captain said. "They are maintaining a respectful distance. They are not gloating." The commander pulled the mask away. His voice was a rasping shadow. "They are not gloating because they know how close it was. They saw the same ghost we did." The destroyer captain nodded. "The world is smaller than the politicians think. Rest now. We are under tow. We are going home." On the bridge of the Truman, the admiral watched the Russian lights fade into the mist. The immediate danger was gone. But the mystery of the steel shadow remained. The Russians had a submarine that could bypass the best sensors in the American inventory, and the Americans had a carrier that could be touched by an enemy it could not see. The admiral turned to the captain. "Send a message to 6th Fleet Command. Tell them the contact is resolved, but tell them we need a complete review of our inner screen protocols. The next time this happens, the man on the other side might not be so interested in talking." The morning was beginning to gray in the east. The sky was turning a pale, bruised purple. The crisis was over, but the quiet that followed felt like a warning. 5:30 in the morning. The Ionian Sea transitioned from a void of black water to a cold and metallic gray as the first light of dawn touched the horizon. 10 miles to the west, the USS Harry Truman maintained its course. The carrier was no longer running silent. Its radar arrays spun with a rhythmic persistence. Its engines pushed the massive hull through the swells at 20 knots. The crisis had passed. The Russian ocean-going tug, the Nikolai Chaiker, had successfully secured a heavy steel tow line to the bow of the Kazan. The submarine was a low, dark shape on the surface. It was no longer venting smoke. It looked like a piece of industrial debris being dragged across the ocean. The Vice Admiral Kulikov moved in a close escort position. Its guns were centered. Its sensors were focused on the path ahead. There was no more posturing. There was only the slow and difficult work of salvage. 6:15 in the morning. On the bridge of the Truman, the captain stood by the starboard wing. He looked at the spot where Seaman Recruit Miller had been standing 4 hours earlier. The area was quiet now. The morning air was sharp and clean. The smell of salt had replaced the scent of ozone and burning chemicals. The captain turned as Admiral Harrison joined him. The admiral looked like he had aged 5 years in a single night. "I just spoke with Miller," the captain said. "He is in his bunk." The medical officer gave him a sedative. The kid was shaking. The admiral nodded. He should be shaking. He saw the end of the world coming, and he stayed at his post. "We owe him more than a commendation. We owe him the fact that we are still standing on this deck." The sensor logs are being encrypted for, quote, "transport to Naples," the captain added. The Project Silent Shield engineers are already arguing. They want to know why. The acoustic array filtered out the Kazan as background noise. It filtered it out because the Kazan was not moving like a submarine, the admiral said. It was drifting. It was a metal log in the water. The software saw a massive contact but decided it was a thermal layer or a whale. It took a human eye to see the truth. 6:45 in the morning. On the Russian destroyer Kulikov, the atmosphere was equally somber. The crew worked in silence. There was no sense of victory in having survived the encounter. They had been forced to rely on the restraint of the Americans to avoid a massacre. The destroyer captain stood on his bridge, watching the tow line. The tension in the wire was steady. The Kazan was moving at 6 knots. It would take days to reach a friendly port. He looked at his communications officer. "Have we received a response from Northern Fleet Command?" the captain asked. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "They have acknowledged our report. The official line will be that the Kazan was conducting a pre-planned surface exercise and experienced a minor mechanical fluctuation. There will be no mention of the American carrier." The captain looked out at the vast, empty horizon. "A minor fluctuation. We nearly traded nuclear salvos over a broken cooling pump. The historians will never know how close the clock came." To midnight. 7 o'clock in the morning. The distance between the two groups was now 15 miles. On the radar screens, the Russian ships were small green dots moving slowly to the northeast. On the flight deck of the Truman, the morning flight operations began. The roar of F-18 Super Hornets filled the air as they were catapulted into the sky. It was the sound of a return to normalcy. But it was a fragile normalcy. Inside, the Combat Information Center, the technicians watched the jets take off. They were professional, they were focused, but they no longer trusted the empty space on their screens. Every few minutes, a sailor would look up from their console and glance toward the visual monitors. They were looking for shadows. They were looking for ghosts. The crisis had fully resolved. There were no shots fired. No metals were being polished. The two most powerful navies in the world had brushed against each other in the dark, and both had stepped back from the edge. It was a victory of human judgment over machine logic. But as the sun rose higher, everyone involved knew that the next shadow might not be so easy to chase away. 3 days later, 10 o'clock in the morning. Naval support activity. Naples, Italy. The briefing room was windowless and smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. Admiral Harrison sat at the head of a long mahogany table. Across from him were 4 civilian analysts from the Office of Naval Intelligence and 2 senior engineers from the Project Silent Shield development team. On the wall, a large digital screen showed a playback of the sensor data from the night of the encounter. The lead engineer pointed at a flat green line on the graph. "The system functioned exactly as it was programmed, Admiral. That is the problem. The Kazan was experiencing a catastrophic power loss. It was not using its main propulsion. It was not cavitating. It was drifting in a thermal layer that perfectly matched its hull temperature." "Explain the acoustic silence," the Admiral said. "An 80,000-ton submarine does not just become a hole in the water. It does if it is venting high-pressure air and steam at a specific frequency," the analyst replied. "The Project Silent Shield algorithm is designed to filter out environmental clutter. It saw the steam bubbles and the venting gas. It classified the noise as a volcanic vent or a localized seismic event. As a ghost image caused by our own wake, the Admiral leaned back. "So the more advanced we made the sensor, the easier it was to trick. We taught the computer what a submarine sounds like, but we did not teach it what a dying submarine sounds like." 11:15 in the morning. In a smaller room down the hall, Seaman Recruit Miller sat in a hard plastic chair. He was wearing his dress whites. He looked exhausted. A naval investigator sat across from him with a digital recorder. "Tell me again, Miller," the investigator said. "What made you certain it was a submarine?" The bridge officers said the visibility was near zero. Miller looked at his hands. "It was not just the shape, sir. It was the way the water moved around it. It did not look like a wave. It looked like something heavy was pushing the ocean out of its way. My grandfather was a fisherman. He always told me that the eyes see what the brain tries to ignore. I saw a shadow that was darker than the night around it. I just knew it did not belong there." The investigator nodded and turned off the recorder. "You did well, son. If you had waited another 60 seconds to report that contact, we would be talking about a collision instead of a close call. 1:30 in the afternoon. The strategic fallout was already rippling through the Defense Headquarters facility and the Kremlin. A private memo had been sent through the Washington-Moscow hotline. It was not an apology. It was a professional acknowledgement of the risks involved in close-quarters electronic warfare. Both nations realized that their automated systems had nearly triggered a conflict that neither side wanted. The report concluded that the Steel Shadow incident was a failure of algorithmic over-reliance. The military forces immediately issued a fleet-wide directive. From that day forward, no carrier strike group would operate under total electronic silence. Without a doubled complement of human lookouts equipped with enhanced thermal optics, the human backup was no longer a secondary protocol. It was now a mandatory requirement for fleet survival. The Kazan was still under tow, moving slowly toward the foreign military port of Polyarny. It would be months before the full extent of its mechanical failure was known, but in the halls of intelligence agencies, the narrative was already set. The most advanced stealth technology in the world had been defeated by a 19-year-old lookout and the simple courage of a foreign military commander who chose to speak when the machines went silent. The admiral stood up and walked to the map on the wall. The Mediterranean was a complex web of blue and gray. "The machines are fast," he whispered to himself, "but they are not wise." 1 month later, 10:15 in the morning, the Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. Admiral Harrison stood before a closed session of the North Atlantic Council. The room was filled with the most senior military minds of 20 nations. He did not use a digital presentation. He did not show a video. He placed a small, orange handheld maritime radio on the mahogany podium. It was a replica of the one used by the commander of the Kazan. To the men in the room, it looked like a toy. To the admiral, it was the most important piece of technology in the Mediterranean. The admiral spoke slowly. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a man who had seen the end of the world and turned back. "We have spent 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars trying to remove the human element from the battlefield. Project Silent Shield was the pinnacle of that effort. It was a system designed to think for us, to see for us, to hide us. And on the night of the incident, it worked perfectly. It followed every line of code. It obeyed every algorithm, and because of that perfection, it nearly started a nuclear war." He paused, looking at the faces in the rows of seats. "The Kazan did not beat our sensors. It broke them by being broken itself. Our machines were looking for a predator. They were not programmed to see a victim. We have created a navy of ghosts, and we forgot that ghosts are hard to talk to when things go wrong." 10:45 in the morning. The strategic assessment continued. The official report on the Steel Shadow incident remained classified at the highest level. The public was told that the USS Harry Truman had conducted a routine exercise in the Ionian Sea, and that a Russian submarine had experienced minor mechanical issues nearby. The truth was buried in a vault in the basement of the Pentagon. The Kazan had reached the dry docks of the Northern Fleet. The damage was terminal. The explosion in the secondary cooling loop had warped the pressure hull. The most advanced submarine in the Russian inventory was being cut into pieces for scrap metal. The Russian commander was no longer in uniform. He had been retired with a quiet pension and a stern warning from the state security services. He was a hero who officially did not exist. In the United States, the fallout was more practical. Project Silent Shield was dismantled. The funding was diverted back into traditional acoustic training and human-centric sensor systems. The Navy realized that a computer could calculate a firing solution in a millisecond, but it could not understand the sound of a desperate man firing a green flare into the night sky. 11:15 in the morning. At the Norfolk Naval Base, Petty Officer 3rd Class Miller stood on the pier. He was no longer a seaman recruit. He wore his new rank with a quiet pride that some of his peers found strange. He had been offered a transfer to an intelligence desk in Washington, but he had turned it down. He wanted to stay on the water. He was now an instructor at the Lookout Transition School. He stood before a group of young sailors who were just beginning their first deployments. He held up a pair of standard-issue binoculars. "The radar is a tool," Miller told them. "The sonar is a tool, but they are only as good as the person interpreting the data. Your job is not just to watch the screen. Your job is to watch the world. You are the last line of defense against a mistake that no computer can fix. If you see something that does not belong, you say it. You say it loud, and you say it until someone listens. Because in the dark, the truth is often the only thing that stays silent." High above the Atlantic, the USS Harry Truman was once again at sea. It was moving toward a new station in the North Sea. The flight deck was a flurry of activity as jets launched and landed. The carrier looked invincible. It looked like the undisputed master of the ocean. But on the bridge, the watch officers not just look at their consoles. They looked out the windows. They checked the horizons. They looked for shadows in the wake. They had learned that the ocean is a vast and unforgiving place, and that the greatest threat is not the enemy you can see, but the silence you choose to ignore. Modern warfare was once a game of numbers. Now, it was a game of judgment. The steel shadow was gone, but the lesson remained. The most advanced weapons in the world are only as safe as the people who hold the keys. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a sailor can do is choose not to fire. The sun set over the Virginia coast, casting long, golden shadows across the water. The sea was calm. It looked empty. But for those who had been there, the emptiness was no longer a guarantee of peace. It was a reminder to keep watch.